The city did most of its honest work during the day, but its decisions were made after midnight. During the war, everyone had an excuse not to look too closely. Factories ran late, lights stayed on. Men walked with purpose even when they weren't going anywhere important. That made it easy to hide things. By 1942, the city belonged to two groups who never sat in the same room. One counted money, the other moved it. On the east side, behind unmarked doors and quiet stairwells, men handled betting slips the way surgeons handled tools. Calm, precise, personal. They never raised voices. They remembered who had paid late and who never needed reminders. They didn't break bones. They broke schedules. On the west side, near the river and the warehouses, the work was heavier. Trucks came and went. Barrels were rolled. Men stood watch not because they wanted to, but because someone had to. Arguments were settled up close. No one called it violence. They called it sorting things out. As long as the war lasted, the city needed both sides. Wages flowed. Alcohol flowed quietly. Money changed hands fast enough to keep people distracted. But when soldiers started coming home, something shifted. Consumption slowed. Patience disappeared. And the mistakes began. It started with a bookmaker who didn't open his shop one morning. Not late, not sick, just gone. His windows were intact, his books untouched, his chair still pushed under the desk the way he left it. By afternoon, everyone knew. By evening, everyone pretended they didn't. 2 nights later, a warehouse foreman from the west side was found sitting outside a diner long after closing, breathing shallow, not asking for help, not explaining anything. He still showed up to work the next day. That was the city's first warning. The second came when a shipment didn't arrive and no one could agree who was responsible. That's when people stopped saying business trouble and started locking doors. No one announced that the rules had changed. They just stopped being obeyed. By the winter of 1943, the city had learned how to read itself in pieces. A closed storefront meant nothing. A missed delivery meant less. What mattered were the pauses between ordinary things. The ledger men noticed them first. A runner who arrived early instead of late. A bettor who paid everything at once, as if clearing a weight. A bar that stopped taking slips after dark without explanation. Those pauses were messages. On the west side, the producers answered differently. They leaned closer. They showed up in pairs instead of threes. They held conversations in corners that didn't invite listening. When a man needed to be corrected, they corrected him. No spectacle, no witnesses that mattered. People would say he had an accident, and no one asked what kind. In March, a small betting room above a tailor shop was shut down by the landlord without notice. The windows were boarded before sunrise. The lock was changed twice in the same week. It wasn't pressure from the city. The city hadn't asked. 2 nights later, a truck carrying unmarked barrels stalled just long enough under the North Bridge. When it finally arrived, it was missing time, not product. Time. The driver didn't explain. He reported for work the next day with a limp and less interest in conversation. This was how the conflict moved. Sideways. Nobody won a fight outright. Nobody claimed territory publicly. The city remained polite during daylight and precise after midnight. The ledger men adjusted first. They stopped collecting debts themselves. That job passed to people who had no history and no need to explain where they'd been the night before. Records were duplicated. Names were never written in the same place twice. They didn't escalate. They waited. Because information doesn't age well when pressure increases. The producers escalated without realizing they were doing it. They leaned on suppliers harder. They shortened patience. A few men stopped being seen near the river altogether. Word traveled without sentences. We handled it, became enough of an answer. By summer, everyone knew someone who knew someone who had been spoken to. Nobody described what that meant. Elias Hart, watching from years away, would later say that this was when the city chose its side without knowing it had been asked. Not by loyalty, by tolerance. People endured broken schedules more easily than they endured broken bodies. They could accept a missed delivery, a closed shop, an unresolved debt, but the visible damage made them nervous. The producers didn't understand that difference until it was too late. In August, a mid-level distributor tried to move product through a street the ledger men quietly controlled. No threats were made, no warning delivered. The man made it home, but he didn't remember the conversation correctly afterward. He told 3 different versions, and none of them did he sound certain. After that, the producers stopped calling meetings. They started issuing instructions. That was their mistake, because instructions can be traced. Orders imply hierarchy. Hierarchy creates pressure points. The ledger men never issued orders. They created conditions. A doorman forgot a face. A clerk misfiled a name. A favor took longer to repay than expected. Nothing illegal, nothing actionable, just enough to slow the West Side down while everyone else kept moving. By the end of 1943, the city felt heavier. Men drank faster. Windows closed earlier. Silences stretched longer. But factories still ran. Payrolls still cleared. The trains still moved. From the outside, nothing was wrong. Inside, everyone knew the balance was slipping. And the city, experienced in pretending, decided not to intervene, because whichever side won would keep things predictable, and predictability mattered more than justice. No one used the word gone. They said unavailable. They said out of town. They said lying low, because saying gone would have required admitting that something irreversible had happened, and the city had learned to survive by delaying those admissions as long as possible. The man was named Franklin Dow, not important enough to headline anything, not expendable enough to ignore. He kept numbers for the West Side, routes, timings, margins that only mattered if you were moving large amounts of product without wanting to be noticed. Franklin did not miss meetings. That's why his absence lasted exactly 1 day before it became a problem. His office light never turned on that morning. By afternoon, 3 different people said they had spoken to him the night before. By evening, no one could agree on where he had gone. The producers told their people to wait. Waiting had always worked before, but the city had begun behaving differently. Clerks hesitated. Schedules overlapped incorrectly. A shipment sat on a dock for 6 hours because no one wanted to authorize its release. That kind of hesitation spreads. On the east side, the ledger men did not comment. They didn't close rooms or celebrate privately. They did something much quieter. They corrected records. Franklin's name stopped appearing where it usually did, not crossed out, not replaced, just absent, as if it had never been necessary to write it down in the first place. This is how systems erase without announcing. The producers searched.
carefully at first, then less carefully. Two men showed up at a boarding house Franklin used sometimes. They asked questions that didn't require answers. They waited long enough to make the owner uncomfortable. No one had seen him. That was the truth. But it wasn't the useful one. 3 nights later, a pair of West Side enforcers found a runner from the ledger room sitting on a crate behind a closed fish market. He was breathing. Slowly. He
did not try to stand. They did not rush. They did not shout. They sorted it out. The runner returned to work the next week with a bandage he refused to explain and a different route he insisted on taking from then on. This did not restore balance. It made the lines clearer. By late spring, people had stopped pretending the conflict was temporary. It had become structural. Decisions were made with it in mind. Paths avoided. Words chosen carefully. At a diner near the station, a waitress began seating people differently at night. Not by request, by instinct. She never learned why. That summer, the producers attempted a direct response. Not flashy, not loud, just undeniable. They closed access to one of the Ledger men's key drop locations through legal pressure, not force. Complaints, inspection, permits suddenly missing. For 2 weeks, the Ledger rooms adjusted. Payments slowed. Routes changed. People noticed. Then the inspection stopped. The permits reappeared. No explanation was given. The city exhaled. That was when it understood which side could end discomfort faster. Franklin Dowie was never officially reported missing. No file was opened. No search conducted. His landlord said he had paid in cash and left no forwarding address. The producers quietly reassigned his responsibilities. It didn't work. Something he had known couldn't be reconstructed easily. A timing, perhaps, or a habit, or a connection that required trust, built slowly. Work began to grind in small, specific places, and small inefficiencies cost large operations more than any confrontation ever could. By autumn of 1944, the war overseas had reached a fever pitch. Newsreels filled theaters. Announcements crowded storefront windows. The city told itself it had bigger things to worry about. That made it easier to ignore what was happening at home. But nights grew tense. Men listened for footsteps they didn't recognize. Doors were tested twice. Conversations ended abruptly when unfamiliar silhouettes appeared at entrances. The Ledger men still did not retaliate openly. They never needed to. They had learned something fundamental. Control does not require strength. It requires making the cost of resistance slightly higher than the cost of adaptation. Franklin Dow had adapted poorly. The city adapted quickly. And once adaptation becomes habit, reversal feels dangerous. By the end of the year, the conflict had claimed its first name that people would never say aloud again. Not because they were afraid, because pretending not to lose him allowed everything else to keep moving. The war ended loudly. Church bells rang. Factory whistles screamed. People poured into the streets carrying relief they didn't know how to store yet. The city inhaled joy and uncertainty at the same time. And then it noticed something unsettling. Nothing at night changed. The same doors stayed locked. The same alleys stayed avoided. Same names stayed unspoken. Peace overseas didn't dissolve arrangements made quietly at home. If anything, it destabilized them. During the war, urgency had justified everything. Long hours, missed questions, paperwork that never quite caught up. But with the war officially over, patience thinned. People wanted explanations for delays that had once been forgiven. That was dangerous because explanations require accountability, and accountability exposes structure. On the west side, the producers felt it first. Demand dipped, controls tightened. Transport routes that had once been ignored now attracted attention. Inspections returned with seriousness instead of ceremony. Men argued more often, not violently, just sharply. Frustration replaced confidence. One afternoon in March, two men from the producer's side met in a closed office near the docks. They spoke for less than 10 minutes. When they exited, one of them walked directly to the river and stayed there until after dark. He returned home late and told his wife nothing. The ledger men noticed the hesitation immediately. It showed up in numbers, in delays, in an unexpected willingness to renegotiate terms that had once been enforced without discussion. That willingness was interpreted correctly. Weakness rarely announces itself, it asks questions instead. The ledger side responded by simplifying. They reduced the number of people authorized to make decisions. They streamlined routes. They shifted responsibility upward, where fewer individuals could be pressured. And quietly, they began doing something else. They started waiting for mistakes. In May, one came. A distribution permit expired and wasn't renewed on time. A small oversight, the kind that happens when systems are strained and attention wanders. The shipment was delayed, not seized, just delayed. The producer responsible for the paperwork went to city offices twice that week. Each time he returned with less certainty and more caution. By the third visit, someone else handled the task. That switch mattered because it signaled to everyone watching that authority had fractured. By summer, altercations began happening earlier in the evening, not because things had escalated, but because there was less patience to postpone them. A man was spoken to outside a warehouse before midnight for the first time in years. People noticed, not the act, the timing. In July, the ledger men closed 3 betting rooms simultaneously without explanation. No confrontation, no announcement. They simply relocated operations. The neighborhoods adjusted. The producers attempted to reassert control by consolidating production. Larger facilities, fewer locations, heavier presence. This was gamble. Consolidation creates targets. In September, a foreman left the facility at an unusual hour and never returned to work. No one saw him leave. No one heard anything unusual. His keys were found in a drawer they did not belong in. The producers held meetings behind closed doors after that. Voices rose slightly higher than usual. Trust thinned. The city observed without intervening because no one wanted to pick a side openly. They wanted stability to win. By the end of 1945, the outcome was no longer in question. It wasn't decided by who could intimidate more effectively. It was decided by who made fewer demands of the city. The ledger men asked less. They disrupted less. They adapted faster. And as the year closed, a quiet understanding spread through the night economy. The fighting was over. No one celebrated because nothing visible had changed. The city woke each morning feeling oddly relieved without knowing why. And that relief hardened into loyalty, not to people, not to organizations, but to predictability itself. The war had ended. The city had already chosen peace on its own terms. Victory didn't announce itself. It settled.
In the month after the last adjustments
were made, the city felt lighter, not safer, not kinder, just easier to move through. Doors opened when they were supposed to. Deliveries arrived on schedules that stopped slipping. People stopped asking who had authority because authority stopped needing to introduce itself. That was the Ledger men's final move. They didn't take territory, they raised friction. On the west side, the producers tried to adapt by becoming smaller. Fewer trucks, fewer nights, fewer faces that could be remembered. They told themselves this was strategy, not retreat. But small operations depend on trust, and trust had leaked out of the city quietly, replaced by compliance. One by one, names stopped being useful. A distributor closed temporarily and never reopened. A storage space sat empty long enough that a different company assumed it had always been theirs. A supervisor took a job 2 towns over and didn't give notice. No one chased them. Chasing would have required admitting loss. The ledger rooms absorbed what remained without absorbing anyone. No mergers, no takeovers, just adjustments to listings, odds, hours. The city learned new habits without noticing they were new. Elias Hart would later say that this was the most violent phase because it didn't bruise anyone. It erased roles. A role that no longer exists doesn't need defending. By autumn, the producers' meetings grew quieter, shorter. Fewer people spoke. The decisions took longer to agree on and were implemented with less confidence. When one man suggested a show of force, something visible, something final, the room went still. No one supported him, not because they had become moral, because they had become tired. Visibility attracts attention. Attention attracts questions. And questions attract answers nobody could afford to give anymore. Instead, they began negotiating exits, not formally, not collaboratively, individually. A plan sold at a loss to a buyer who promised to keep workers. A route was handed off to a third party with connections no one wanted to verify. Equipment disappeared into legitimate supply chains so completely that even the people who used it forgot where it came from. This is how an empire ends without falling, by dissolving into acceptable pieces. The city didn't mourn the producers. It didn't celebrate their absence either. Most people could not have named them accurately in the first place. What the city noticed was the absence of disruption. Nights shortened, voices lowered. The feeling that something might happen receded into background noise. In December, a final warehouse closed near the river. Not seized, not boarded, just sold. The new owners repainted it and posted hours that matched everyone else's. A man who had worked security there for years stopped by a diner on his way home and told the waitress he was changing jobs. "Seems like things are settling down," he said. She nodded. "About time." Neither of them mentioned why. By the end of 1946, the war for the city was over in every way that mattered. The Ledger men no longer needed to prove control. Control existed as a set of expectations. The city enforced on itself rules that don't need enforcers, last longest. The last mistake the producers made was thinking survival meant staying present. In this city, survival meant knowing when to leave nothing behind. The strangest thing about the year after the fighting stopped was how quickly the city forgot there had been a fight at all. By early 1947, people stopped referring to the previous years as troubled. They called them unclear. Then, not long after that, they stopped calling them anything. Memory Like crime needs reinforcement to survive. The ledger men understood this better than anyone. They did not build monuments to their control. They did not celebrate anniversaries. They did not tell stories. They normalized outcomes. Betting rooms were fewer but steadier. Payments arrived on time. Disputes were resolved before voices rose. People stopped locking doors out of fear and started locking them out of habit. That distinction mattered. On the west side, the last remnants of the producers were nearly invisible. A small distillery changed ownership without comment. A truck road was reclassified under a legitimate distributor. Men who had once stood in pairs outside warehouses now stood alone at different jobs, wearing clean jackets and keeping their heads down. When asked what they used to do, they gave answers that required no follow up. Logistics, transport, sales. The city accepted those answers eagerly because acceptance meant closure without inquiry. Elias Hart, watching it all from the distance of years, would later describe 1947 as the moment the city finished deciding, not between gangs, between narratives. One version of the past required acknowledging conflict, the other required silence. The city chose silence because silence asked nothing of it. A city clerk accidentally uncovered an old set of complaints that summer. Noise reports, permit disputes, missing inventory filings tied loosely to the West Side operations. She mentioned them in passing to her supervisor. He told her to archive them with completed matters. They don't connect to anything active, he said. That was true. They didn't. By 1948, power in the city no longer introduced itself. It didn't knock. It didn't threaten. It didn't explain. It waited. The ledger men reduced their footprint again that year. Fewer rooms, fewer hours, fewer people who could be noticed leaving or arriving. It looked like restraint to outsiders. It was something else entirely. Completion. When a system reaches that stage, it stops asking for permission from the present. It begins planning for the future without consulting memory. The West Side had been absorbed, not defeated. Its roots existed now as contracts. Its equipment existed as inventory under different names. Its people existed as employees who never listed their prior work in the same way twice. The city benefited from the cleanliness of it. Arguments at council meetings shortened. Permits passed without amendments. Cash flow stabilized. And with stability came confidence, the dangerous kind. Confidence makes people curious. In March, a new face tried to open a late-night operation near the old rail spur. Small, clean, loud enough to be noticed. He told people he was independent. He didn't ask questions. He didn't wait. He lasted 8 days. On the 9th, he closed early and didn't reopen. His signage came down neatly. His lease was voided without complaint. He left town by the end of the month. No one mentioned him again, because by then the city had learned what independence looked like in practice. It looked temporary. That spring, Elias Hart, older now, slower, watched a meeting from the back of a hall where a civic group discussed economic growth. A speaker praised transparency, another praised cooperation. A third praised how disagreements seemed to resolve themselves. Elias did not smile. He had seen disagreements resolve themselves before. They do so when there are no acceptable alternatives left. In June, a minor scuffle broke out behind a closed warehouse. Two men raised voices, pushed too far. It ended quickly, with apologies and a quiet understanding that neither would pursue it further. The city noticed not the scuffle, but the apology. That was new. Years earlier, apologies would have been read as weakness. Now, they were read as professionalism. Power had learned a new language. By late summer, betting slips arrived on time everywhere. Not earlier, not later, exactly when expected. Predictability hardened into trust. Trust hardened into habit. Habit erased questions. The leisure men did not need to remind anyone who they were. They no longer had a rival to define themselves against. They were simply the way things were done. And that came with a cost they had anticipated. When you become normal, you stop being protected by fear. In October, a small audit triggered concern, not investigation. Concern. Numbers that were correct but too precise. Patterns that worked too smoothly to be accidental. A clerk mentioned it to a supervisor. The supervisor asked what would happen if it were pursued. The clerk thought about it. Schedules might change, he said. That would be disruptive. The supervisor replied. The matter was closed. That was when Elias Hart understood the final shape of what had been built. The city did not obey the ledger men. It defended them, not by loyalty, by aversion. Aversion to disruption. Aversion to explanation. Aversion to asking how order had arrived without ceremony. In December, lights filled the streets again. Families walked late without glancing behind them. Businesses planned expansions without contingency language. The city slept better. And when a city sleeps better, it dreams less about consequences. Years later, people would say the city cleaned itself up. They would say it matured, that it learned how to manage disagreement, that it outgrew its rough years. That is how cities talk about the moment they stop asking questions. No one ever announced who won the war for control. No newspaper wrote it. No courtroom confirmed it. Because the outcome didn't need witnesses. The side that survived did not survive by being stronger, louder, or more feared. They survived by becoming necessary. When people woke up and things worked, they stopped caring about how they had come to work. When schedulers held and payments cleared, memory became optional. When routine stabilized, curiosity became inconvenient. That is how power finishes its work, not by force, but by removing the need to speak its name. The men who lost were not erased in a single night. They were reassigned, redirected, softened into normalcy. Some left the city. Some stayed and learned to speak carefully. None of them were remembered as opponents, only as people who had once been around. And that is the quietest form of defeat. I have lived long enough to watch cities repeat this pattern without recognizing it. They believe control is something that announces itself. It rarely does. Control arrives when disagreement becomes exhausting, when disruption feels irresponsible, and when stability is valued more than truth. The city did not choose violence. It chose predictability. And once that choice is made, it protects it instinctively. Even now, if you ask why certain things work the way they do, you'll be given explanations that make sense without explaining anything. Because the city does not need to remember who won. It only needs to remember that nothing's allowed to change too quickly. That was the real outcome of the war. Not domination, not peace, but a system so well adjusted that no one feels the weight of the hands still holding it in place. And that is how the city remained calm. Not because the fighting ended, but because it learned to live comfortably inside the result, because everything they had once described no longer had a name. In August, a man named Leon Pike was assaulted outside a closed cinema after midnight. Not badly enough to require hospital care, enough to remember. Leon had once handled collections for the producers. No one asked why it happened. No one connected it to anything else. Leon moved out of the city by winter. People said he'd gotten married. People said he'd found work elsewhere. Both could have been true. By then, truth had narrowed to what didn't disrupt routine. In September, a columnist wrote about how the city had found its footing after the war. He praised order, responsibility, and community cooperation. Readers clipped the article and pinned it above desks. No one commented on what the article didn't mention. No violence, no disappearances, no restructuring that hadn't been voted on. Stability, once established, edits history retroactively. By the end of the year, the only people who still remembered the conflict clearly were the ones who no longer spoke about it. They understood something the city did not need to hear. Power that proves itself loudly invites replacement. Power that becomes invisible gets mistaken for normality. The ledgermen had not won because they were smarter or stronger. They had won because they understood what cities ultimately defend. Not morality, not loyalty, predictability. By Christmas, the streets were calm. Lights reflected in shop windows without interruption. People made plans months in advance without worrying whether those plans would hold. That was the real victory. Not the removal of rivals, but the removal of uncertainty. And once uncertainty leaves a place, rarely remembers who forced it out.